Hi, this is Paul. I decided a couple weeks ago it was probably time now, after 3 years, to do a little bit of a retrospective on what I've done with my channel. How did I get here? And even just saying it that way is, I think, a telling thing in terms of all the thinking I've done over the last 3 years. Why do I use a spatial reference to figure out where I am, to orient myself in the world? Well, part of it is because I'm in a strange place. Now, that sounds like a weird thing because I've been sitting in this office 3, 4, 5 days a week for the past 23 years. Going to be 24 years this August. How has this place changed? Well, even when I say that, how has this place changed? That idea just cascades out into so many different aspects. Now, I'm a pastor of a church, and I continue to not be certain the church will make it through COVID. Not because the people have COVID, but because of the way that the virus is just disrupting normal patterns of people's lives. We've had members that have dropped out. We have no idea how many new members will come after COVID or what the church will look like. So, yeah, these are all the kinds of things that I think about. And I think almost every pastor in, I think most pastors wonder what their church will look like when they come out of COVID, just because things have been so enormously disruptive. And I don't mean that just with churches that have closed down entirely or gone on to Zoom, but I mean that in terms of even churches that have decided to play the culture war card and keep meeting as if nothing is happening. Well, things change regardless of whether you change with the things because of the agent-arena relationship. At the same time, I would have to argue that I'm the most effective evangelist I've ever been. And I can't even say that without asking myself what on earth the job of an evangelist is. Now, I know for many of you hearing that who are Christians, you'll say, well, that's obvious that you make more. Well, okay, right there you're forced to describe it in some specific way. Make more disciples of Jesus Christ, or get more people, use an action-oriented frame of reference, get more people to go to church, or have people use a profession of faith frame of reference, have people profess with their lips and believe in their heart, to use a New Testament phrase. So on one hand, just by virtue of the ongoing conversations and emails and tweets and messages I get from people, I'm the most effective evangelist I've ever been, but yet it's harder to see the fruit than in a normal pastorate. Normally, you would say, well, a pastor is being an effective evangelist if his church is growing and if more people are being baptized. But I'm not operating in that kind of arena. I'm operating in a very different arena. Now, this might all be the idiosyncrasies of what has happened to Paul Vanderklay in 2017 to 2021, but I don't think so. I think, in fact, these kinds of disruptions that are forced by technology are going to continue to disrupt the church, and churches, whether they're leaning and pushing against it or whether they're sort of going with the flow, will be impacted by these dynamics that are happening all around us. So again, I thought it was a good time to do a retrospective, and I usually have many intentions for these kinds of things, and I have difficulty following through. Maybe that's my conscientious score. But I want to do this first video to tell my story a little bit for those of you who perhaps haven't heard it, or when I say it 3 years later, like now, maybe haven't heard it the way I'm telling it now. Because how I would tell the story in November, December of 2017, when this whole thing sort of broke for me, how I would tell it in 2018, how I would tell it in 2019, how I would tell it in 2020, and now in January 2021, it's all different because the story looks different because I'm standing in a different place. Now, working my craft. I've been working my craft for a long time. Well, what is my craft? I'm a pastor. I'm a Protestant minister, and I keep emphasizing to people that there are distinctions between a Protestant minister and, let's say, a Roman Catholic and Orthodox priest that are significant. Now, fairly early, well, not really fairly early on, at some point in my ministry, well, let me take it all the way back. When I was a young lad in seminary and they were teaching us how to be effective preachers and pastors, one of the things that they emphasized was a filing cabinet. And if you talk to the likes of, now I'm going to use some in-house language here because these are the people in my neighborhood. If you talk to the likes of Scott Jose, I should probably have Scott on the channel. That would be quite fun. If you talk to the likes of someone like Scott Jose, who most of you don't know, Scott Jose, when I was in seminary, was the teacher's assistant of Neil Plantinga. Neil Plantinga is a name that more of you will know just by virtue of the name Plantinga. His older brother, Alvin Plantinga, is a much more famous philosopher. Neil Plantinga is the youngest of the Plantinga boys, and Neil Plantinga is a theologian, and he was the president of the seminary eventually, but when I was at Calvin Seminary, he was the professor of systematics, and almost anyone will tell you one of the best professors at the seminary. His lectures were amazing. They were just amazing. And Neil Plantinga has not written anywhere near as many books as we need from him. And I really hope that now in, I think, what is probably somewhat of a retirement, I really hope he's writing books, and I really hope he can get books out. He is the kind of guy who is very careful with his speech and is very devoted to the craft. Anyway, back to my story. Back in the 1980s, sound like an ELO song. Back in the 1980s, when I was in seminary, when personal computing was just coming on and we used them as glorified word processors, we were admonished to keep careful files on things we read in newspapers and magazines. And you can see this practice in Tim Keller. This is sort of being a pastor 101. If you want to preach to people, you're going to need sermon illustrations, and the sermon illustrations need to be timely in the lives of the people. And so you had better be reading the same newspaper as the people in your church, and you'd better be reading the same magazines as the people in your church. You'd better be participating in the same sociocultural bubbles as the people in the church. And if you're going to manage these things and somehow intersect these things with the lectionary or the Heidelberg Catechism, or however you're deciding to organize your preaching, you had better keep a file cabinet full of these things so that when you're doing a sermon on such and such a thing, you can remember that article you read a few years ago and decide, I'm going to pull it up and use it. Well, that was in the 1980s, and of course in the 1990s, computers came along, and I very quickly realized that well, I could read the Sacramento Bee, but a lot of the stuff that was happening in the hearts and minds of my people were not just happening in the Sacramento Bee. They were happening on television. How was I going to capture some of that? So I started using a TiVo, and I started playing around with computer technology where I could capture videos. And I also recognized that in many ways, movies were the dominant religious indoctrination of our culture. And so I have a huge catalog of DVDs because at a certain point in my ministry, I was using a lot of movie illustrations for things. And when I came to Living Stones fairly early on, I wanted to use graphics in my sermons. Why? Well, actually, growing up, I remember my father doing that in Patterson. He would have an overhead and a little marker, and he would draw little pictures on the overhead to illustrate points he was making in his sermons. I didn't think a thing of it then, but when I got to Living Stones and started to have to preach twice a week, I wanted to expand what I was doing. I also was reading books sort of about cognitive science of the day. not even of the day, but preacher cognitive science, preacher psychology, recognizing that there were I'd always been an auditory learners and kinesthetic learners and visual learners, and I wanted to include some of the visual learners at least as much as I could, and sometimes the kinesthetic learners in the context of my preaching. And so not too long after we were here, I convinced some of the members of the church that what we really needed was a screen up front and a video projector. And we paid an horrendous amount of money for that early video projector. And the screen was quite large, thanks to the foresight of a very smart member of the church who was still very integral in all the media things that we do now. And I started using PowerPoint with my sermons. Now, that was a fad for a while with preaching, and a lot of preachers sort of played with it for a little while and went away from it. A lot of preachers were sort of using movie clips and movie illustrations in the 90s or the late 90s, early aughts for a while and sort of went away from it, but I kept up with it. I also needed to address the filing cabinet issue, and eventually I was using various Evernote. There are a variety of archiving things. Google for a while had a product called Google Notebook, which I really enjoyed. And then, as with many things Google, they lost interest in it and took it down, and I lost a really helpful tool. I eventually settled on something that I figured would be most durable, having learned my lesson from Google Notebook, and I started keeping a blog. And instead of just using that blog for little messages I wanted to send out into the world to sort of shape the broad spiritual zeitgeist, I decided that what I was going to do was use my blog for a variety of things, not unlike how I've used my YouTube channel. I wanted to use it for engagement. I also wanted to use it for a filing system, because when I would find something online, and increasingly videos were coming online, so you had YouTube and blogs and articles and newspapers are online. Actually, a blog is a pretty good way to store things that in a searchable format. So you can just do a search on your own blog and find all kinds of other things. Now, the blog never proved to be the most excellent filing system out there, but then again, I was never the most disciplined or organized filer around either. It was one giant bucket that I could throw everything into, and along the way I could, and then I figured out, my sermons were a little better if I would, try to write out at least a rough draft of them. And so what you'd find on my blog, if you'd go there, would be a lot of rough drafts of sermons before I ever had the segment on my channel, Rough Draft to Sunday, which the preposition continues to annoy me, but I'm keeping it here because it annoys me. But that's what I did with my blog. And, I'd get maybe 200 or 300 hits a day on the blog. And I would also start poking around in denominational matters on the blog, because I was increasingly convicted that as a church, our denomination wasn't functioning very well. And for me, one of the most important chapters of that lack of functionality was the campaign to include the Belhar Confession as a fourth confession. Now, I won't go into all of the gritty little details about that, but in some ways, for me, it was a small-scale learning about the dynamics of propaganda, of what a group of people who have the reins on the denominational magazine, the denominational infrastructure. Because for the most part, the Christian Reformed Church has its own culture war going on almost continually. And there is a right and a left. And not surprisingly, the right and the left in the Christian Reformed Church, although it's a binational denomination, so you have Canada and the United States, the right and the left in the denomination were sort of reflecting the right and the lefts in the United States. And what you had then in the push for the Belhar were a group of people denominationally who, for the most part, didn't pay a lot of attention to the three confessions that the denomination has, the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession, and the Canons of Dort, but they wanted a fourth. and they wanted very much to get the fourth through, and they wanted to get the fourth through because there's a certain amount of anxiety among some people, not all people, but some people, that if the Christian Reformed Church didn't get the Belhar in, then the CRC would somehow be more racist than it normally is. And I don't want to make small of that issue. I think there's some real important elements to that issue. But from where we're sitting at today, you can really see how this issue anticipated the kinds of issues we're seeing in the denomination overall. And having grown up in Patterson as I did, having been basically on the left wing of the CRC as I was, I had a rather particular perspective on this. And whereas, part of me was quite delighted to see a confession coming from Africa potentially being a part of the Christian Reformed confessional portfolio, I was more disturbed by the way that both sides were treating each other. And again, in some ways, these things anticipate what we're seeing in the broader society. And so what I advocated on my little blog was that we in the denomination have better confessional conversations. And that would take up a certain resonance later as we get into the LGBT same-sex issues in the denomination. But I had noticed that there was a certain degree of happy rigor mortis, confessional rigor mortis that had set in. Conservatives, being conservative, wanted to keep things the same. Progressives, being progressive, wanted to imagine we can easily improve on what we have and make it better. And there's a certain inevitability in that dynamic, and there's a certain wisdom in that dynamic, but there's also a certain naivete in that dynamic that had set into the denomination. And so basically, and again, in some ways, this sort of anticipated what would come later in terms of the IDW, because my take on the IDW is that for the most part, they are left-wing people who are annoyed and wanting to point out left-wing tyranny. And I think in some ways the Weinstein brothers are at the height of that. So, yeah, I used my little blog as a filing cabinet, as a way to put up rough drafts for sermons, and as a way to sort of poke around at the denomination as it was trying to adjust to say, hey, let's have better conversations and not just political votes. I'd been doing quite a bit of writing, and obviously I had a lot I wanted to say. That is sort of temperamental for me. And so I'd think about, should I write a book? And I toyed with ideas, and I talked to some people. And in fact, the one time I came closest to actually writing something was actually about things quite central to where my current channel is, sort of the relationship between the relational and the personal, in terms of how to understand in a modernistic frame what on earth is happening in Christianity. And pastors often, when they do this kind of thing, they write books. And I have friends and colleagues who have written books, and I've watched how that has unfolded. And usually it was some small publishing house or someone, and if they're a little bit more successful, they have a little bit bigger of a publishing house, and they write a Christian book, and it sort of goes out on the circuits that Christian books go out on. Let's say a couple of successful people in my circles would be James K. Smith. He's been unusually successful in those circles. Chuck DeGroat, who actually grew up in a church that my grandfather pastored from Long Island, and he teaches at Western Seminary in Holland, Michigan right now, and is a really fine man. And I had a chance to work with him for a little while with some projects locally before he moved to Michigan. And a friend and colleague of mine, Kevin Adams, who's written a number of books. And I watched, and I think I think for pastors who are thinking about writing, I think I would give the same advice to them that I've given to people about having a blog or having a YouTube channel, which is, if you're going to do something like this, do it whether or not anyone reads it. Because in many ways, the real payoff of the book will likely not be financial. As I watch, unless pastors are pastoring mega churches or they have a large following, I dare bet they're not even making minimum wage in terms of the time they put in writing a book. I'm probably not making minimum wage in terms of the time I put in my YouTube channel. But I do it for my own reasons. And I certainly don't do it for the money. And, the money is helpful in terms of, I've got a little better camera. I've got a little better lens. I've got, I can update my computer rig now and then. I can, maybe update my production qualities here in this picture if you're watching the YouTube video. This was an early attempt at something, because I thought about book writing and I thought, no, if I write a book, maybe the people in my church and my mother will buy it to just show their support and pride that I actually managed to write a book, which is no small accomplishment, something that I have not yet been able to do. But will they read it? Will it impact them? Will it change them? And part of why I didn't want to write a book was because the kinds of things I wanted to write about, I knew most people would barely be interested in it. Again, my mother would buy it and have it on her shelf just to show that she was proud of me and because she's my mother. And a few nerdy friends might read it, but yeah, I didn't know that it would really be worth my while, then especially. And so I began to think about how normal people live, and I noticed that normal people watch TV. And for those of you who remember the genesis of the Freddie and Paul show, we haven't had too many episodes lately because of COVID, but there will be more episodes of the Freddie and Paul show, rest assured. In some ways, the Freddie and Paul show is a really rough draft to YouTube, where Freddie is a very willing collaborator with me as I try out different things. And so I just recently picked up a gimbal, and Freddie wants to do Freddie wants to incorporate movement and dance in terms of his rapping. And so, the Freddie and Paul show might go to another level soon, which is fine with me. It's, Freddie's my friend, and I enjoy working on projects with him. He's not an uncomplicated partner in projects, but, Freddie enjoys this, and as long as I imagine that this is good for everyone involved, I'll probably keep participating in it, even if it likely hurts my YouTube algorithm. But I began to think, well, why not try YouTube? And so I did after CRC Synod, I did a post-game show on the Synod. After I was doing my adult Sunday school class, I decided to do a summary of the book of Daniel from some things that I had learned in doing my Sunday school class. And you can see one thing I knew was that I didn't want to sit down and really have to learn a lot of video editing. And I didn't really want to have some collaborative partnerships with someone who would edit videos for me, and I'd send off my video and then they would edit it, and then I would look at it and then I would tweak it or ask them to edit it. That's just takes way too much time, even though perhaps the quality would be better and my YouTube presence would soar if I actually sat down and wrote and was disciplined and organized and all of these things. But that's not why I'm doing this. I'm only partly doing it for you. I'm mostly doing this for me. And that's why often I'll tell people that my YouTube channel is really very selfish, because I'm doing this for me. And, well, we'll get to you in a minute. But I had this old computer that I bought from Dell years ago, and it was the biggest screen I had, and it was semi-portable, and I was using it for other things in church. And so I thought, well, I'll set this up. And in fact, even recently, Rick has been trying to improve the quality of my productions. And he looked at this and said, I showed my girlfriend a bunch of your different videos just to look at aesthetics and to ask her what she liked and didn't like. And she said, this is one that this is a setup that she liked. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Because I had a camera in front of me and I had the video behind me and I was doing all kinds of crazy things. And later in that video, I actually edited the video. I did this, obviously, you can see in July 5, 2017, I was at that point playing with these ideas, and I was already at this point watching Jordan Peterson quite a bit, and some of Jordan Peterson's ideas were working in my mind, the YouTube aspect was working in my mind, and I made a video, and you can find, I think this video is probably on the church channel. You can see the audience is fairly small because I've got 54 thumbs up, and my nemesis has not yet found the video. There's always, 1 to 5 who thumbed down my videos, which is fine. Now, one of the things that I was really dealing with in terms of my mental, theological, intellectual life was, I will call now, a discarded image and a divided church. Because every week as a pastor, I wrestled with a Bible that speaks in a language almost nobody in the church understands. And I don't mean English, Greek, or Hebrew. I would often point out that the famous passage in the Gospel of Matthew in the King James, "In my Father's house there are many mansions," and many other little things in the King James that people really like. People take that verse and have all these sermons about these mansions up in the sky. And whereas maybe symbolically that works, in terms of the evolution of the English language, that doesn't work, because in Elizabethan England, a manse or a mansion was a different thing than it is today. That's just how language evolves. But the bigger evolutions of language were really, I was continuing to feel the difference between those two worlds. And as a preacher, it was something I couldn't overlook. The Bible is written in a worldview, in multiple worldviews actually, or at least sub-worldviews, that are very different from our own. And as I've mentioned before, when you read a passage like Genesis, let's see if I get more specifically into Genesis. Yeah, I do. When you read a passage like Genesis, people just aren't reading it with the same eyes they did in the 17th or 16th centuries, or in the 11th century, or in the 1st century, or during the time of the Babylonian exile. When I was in seminary and in college, there were perpetual little fights in the Christian Reformed Church over Genesis. And there was a guy in Grand Rapids named Leo Peters who was taking out full-page ads in the Grand Rapids Press against Howard Van Til and the liberals at Calvin College. And at that point, I was dating the woman who would be my wife. She didn't grow up in the Christian Reformed Church, and her mother was a fundamentalist Baptist. Her father was a Lutheran pastor who was killed in a car accident years before. But I would have very interesting conversations with my mother-in-law as a fundamentalist Baptist about what Leo Peters was putting in the Grand Rapids Press. And of course, I was at seminary at the time learning all this highfalutin stuff about Hebrew and Greek and theology, and very much feeling the tension, but those tensions never went away. And they would be highlighted in Genesis 1. Now, I'll get to Genesis 1 in a minute, but what I noticed is that people have all sorts of adaptive methods to try to smooth over the discontinuities in the church and in the world. Now, of course, a century earlier, churches were dividing over these very issues. The modernist fundamentalist fight is still with us in many ways. The modernists basically were beginning to recognize the discarded image, as C.S. Lewis called it, and the fact that the Bible is written in all of that language and with all of those terms, and the church simply followed along and had all sorts of ideas, but what to do with the people in the pew. And, one of the big takeaways from Sockel's transubstantiation is he just noted that by the time Martin Luther was reading Thomas Aquinas, the language had changed enough. And, you can blame Martin Luther for what Martin Luther is responsible for, but it was really quite an interesting point that Brett Sockel makes that, Luther and Calvin in some ways are trying to get back to what Aquinas was trying to say. And what Aquinas was trying to say had everything to do with the language that was involved. Now, for some of you, this will be a really annoying and disruptive point to make, but these things matter. And actually, the job of theologians and pastors is to work on this very thing. Now, some of you will say, but how does that impact my relationship with Christ and my prayer life and my Christianity and my belief system? Do I need to have a PhD in linguistics and theology and philosophy in order to be a Christian? And this was one of the issues that I dealt with throughout my ministry, because I had often noted that it was often the people with very simple faith and sometimes embracing the Bible in a very fundamentalistic or literalistic way that had a capacity to love and live lives of careful discipleship in ways that outshone many who had amazing amounts of knowledge about all of these issues I was dealing with. In other words, someone's intelligence is not necessarily in correlation with what I viewed as the quality of their Christian discipleship. And it's for this reason that C.S. Lewis was such an interesting character, because here, on one hand, was someone who was probably better attuned to some of these issues than almost anybody else of his generation, or at least wrote about it more, and who seemed at the same time to have a deeply vibrant personal faith that was displayed in what he did outside of the books that he wrote. And you can read about him in how many of his biographies. And I think it is for that reason that there are a whole lot of reasons why neo-evangelicals and fundamentalists probably should stick up their nose at C.S. Lewis, but they don't, because something of the quality shines through in his work. And so people, in their variety of their accommodations, would look for spiritual truths. And you've noticed I've started doing a commentary. I've started doing a commentary on Matthew Pajot's The Language of Creation. And I like the book. I think in many ways, if you're following this, it's parallel to C.S. Lewis's Discarded Image. But I noticed Matthew was using the same spiritual trick. And it's, again, as I've said in my commentary many times, I don't know a better word, but I do know that when church people hear this word, they default back to their usual accommodation technique of the spiritual. And if there's one thing I'm evolving on, it's that I think when people talk about the spiritual, there's a certain dual substance Cartesian imaginary that is operating, and that, in fact, this imaginary, this coping mechanism, is responsible for a lot of deconstruction and a lot of atheism and unbelief. And that, in fact, if you want to get at this atheism and unbelief, you're going to have to address that Cartesian dualism underneath in their imaginary. So people look for spiritual truths, but what do they really mean by that word? They can't tell you. I know, I've asked them. And so I've been trying to get at what they mean by that word, and I've been trying to get at what the Apostle Paul really says when in the resurrection we'll have a spiritual body. Or, my kingdom is not this world, as N.T. Wright. My kingdom is not from this world, but almost everybody who is sort of on the crunchy Christianity side of the line says, well, my kingdom is not of this world. And so they sort of default into a certain dualism that, again, I think is not helping us. And as I said a few moments ago, I noticed this so clearly in Genesis 1. Because Genesis 1 is a beautiful passage, and there's 6 days, and then the 7th day, it's Genesis 1 to Genesis, beginning of chapter 2. But, as I learned Hebrew, and as I had access to all of these tools, and as we looked at form criticism and source criticism, and then later Brevard Child's canonical approach to Scripture, and then literary structures, and all of this stuff, I would watch people just hammer down on Genesis 1 and 6-day, 6,000-year-old creationism, young earth creationism, and it'd be like, oh, okay. And I would find that many of those people had wonderful, vibrant Christian faiths and discipleship. In fact, a member of my congregation, I've never addressed him specifically on this. At this point in his life, I don't think it would be kind or wise to do so, but he's a world-class scientist, and he sort of teeters on young earth creationism. I'm not going to mention his name, but the science that he works in isn't completely apart from this. I mean, this guy literally, he doesn't do so anymore because he's up in age and because of COVID, but he's flown all over the world to give dramatic and important lectures on global warming. But then when I talked to him about these issues, he's a pretty conservative guy. And so when I would read Genesis 1, well, you would sort of see an ancient Near East conception, and there were lots of conceptions of this in the ancient Near East, where you have the earth, which is flat. Now, we have to get onto that language. The earth, which is flat, and there's seas, and there's mountains, and Sheol is under the earth, and there's foundations of the earth, and there's a firmament. And I remember, reading the Bible in the King James, and then reading the Bible in the Revised Standard Version, and then the NIV says expanse. Oh, NIV, you fudged something fierce with that expanse, because expanse is a very legitimate term to use, because if you do a little research on that word, well, the research comes from, at least current thinking is, hammering metal to widen it so that you can widen it into a bowl. But if you say expanse, that was just the fudgiest move of the NIV. If you say expanse, well, okay, it's an expanse of space. But if you say expanse, most of the people who are sitting in the pews that in terms of their established imaginary say, I'm on a globe, and gravity is holding me down, and atmosphere is up there, and, we're being protected from the radiation of the sun, and this whole world that they're inhabiting. I mean, even this drawing of an ancient Hebrew conception of the universe, they make it in the shape of a globe. I mean, this stuff is so deep, we're not at all aware of it. But if you're reading Genesis 1, and so I would, being the trollish person that I was, I would pester people about this. And I would say, where are the waters above? And people would say, the clouds. And I would say, oh, but read your literalistic Genesis 1 very, very carefully, because the sun, the moon, and the stars are all beneath the firmament. The waters above are above it. Now, of course, you can redo this whole thing and put us on a globe and have a firmament around the universe, et cetera, and actually, it's not a bad way to think about it. But if you're just imagining that Genesis 1 has us on a globe with an open sky and the waters above are the clouds, you're not really taking Genesis 1 as it's written. And I'm not saying that to pester people. I'm saying it to say there's a lot going on here. Way, way more going on here than just whether the waters above are clouds. And that is why we wind up in psychology and cognitive science and language and all of this. Because, as Jonathan Peugeot and many others have noted, something like this is a perfectly legitimate description of the world from a certain point of view. And actually, theologians had made that point before John Calvin made the point. He said, this was how the world looks to a guy on the ground. Augustine had his own workings of this. Origen had his own workings of this. These are hard issues that we've been dealing with forever. But the issues aren't just about cosmology. The issues are about how we know the world and how we can know truth. And, to simply draw a line between literalists and figurative people or symbolic people really doesn't cut it either. So modernists would tend to look at this picture and say, oh, yes, this is the archaic image of the world that we know isn't true. Oh, okay. But as the symbolists will come back and say, well, it's actually very true. You actually live as if the world is this way. I had one history professor, Howard Rienstra, who was one of these people that sort of had a conception about East and West, and he remember talking about this. I think it was in a class I took on Dante, where he just said, it just always seems the world is going in this direction. And, because the world is going. And Howard Rienstra was a wonderful man. And then fundamentalists would say, liberal lies. Genesis 1 says we live on a globe and the firmament are the clouds above. And it's like, no, that's not right either. And as I said before, I would often find fundamentalists reading the Bible poorly, showing dramatically better lives of Christian discipleship as I would measure it in one's capacity to love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love their neighbor as theirself, better than many modernists I knew. It seemed that the modernists in their contemporary sneer were sort of losing a lot of babies with the bathwater. And they were all so proud of themselves for keeping up appearances. That was a wonderful show. That they sort of lost baby Jesus along the way. And so, again, modernists had points. Fundamentalists had points. But what point do you really want to make? Do you really just want to be correct in terms of at least the contemporary understanding of how to read ancient texts? Or do you want to bear witness to Jesus? Now, again, it's not an either-or proposition, which I think most of us can see because there are many people who don't believe that Genesis 1 is talking about a globe circling the sun, who are wonderful, wonderful Christians. And so obviously when you get into the Roman Catholic world or the Orthodox world, things change quickly, but we all live in a zip code. And the neo-evangelicals, of which the Christian Reformed Church, where I was in terms of trying to hold these two sides together as best they could, continue to live in the tension. But, as I've done many times, it's really hard not to default to some long word salady attempt to put these things together. And maybe that's what my whole channel is. It's how it started. And regular folks just keep their heads down and muddle through and read their devotions and pray their prayers and love their children and vote and go to work and try and make the world a better place, even if they can't answer these questions, because the truth is none of us, I don't know, that can ever adequately answer these questions. So 3 cheers for the regular folks. And so C.S. Lewis was very much my conversation partner. This, a passage from Miracles. He finds that God is supposed to have a son, just as if God were a mythological deity like Jupiter or Odin. He finds that this son is supposed to come down from heaven, just as if God had a palace in the sky from which he had to send down his son like a parachutist. World War II, you watch those movies about Operation Market Garden. They don't do that much anymore. He finds that this son then descended into hell, into some land of the dead under the surface of a presumably flat earth, and thence ascend again as if by a balloon into his father's sky palace, where he finally sat down in a decorated chair placed a little to his father's right. Everything seems to presume a conception of reality which the increase of our knowledge has been steadily refuting for the last 2,000 years, and which no honest man in his senses could return to today. And so what I found in C.S. Lewis was a conversation partner who seemed to have gotten here long before me and knew far more about it than I ever did, and who was actually being an honest conversation partner with respect to the issues. And now I know I've mentioned the book Miracles plenty of times, and in some ways my entire channel should be devoted to that book because I keep coming around to it, and people ask, why that book? That book didn't speak to me. But when I read passages like this, I knew Lewis and I are dealing with the same thing, and I need help. But often I don't even realize how much help I need. I'm Martin Luther on the floor of a woods in a thunderstorm saying, help me, Saint Clive. Help me, St. Jack. I need help with this because it's hard. Because I noted that people who in their mind's eye have a sky palace and a sun and a decorated chair are actually being wonderful Christians, and people who are just demythologizing it are being blown by every wind of culture and finding themselves, because the winds blow and change very quickly, with very messed up lives and no appreciable savior to rescue them, at least in terms of how they feel it so. And Lewis seemed to be a guy who figured a lot of it out, messy though his life was. And so, yeah, Lewis, I'm listening. And I've read this book I don't know how many times, and each time I go through it, I find more. And then I listen to guys like Peter Kraft, Peter Kraft, here's another guy. Grew up in the same, a little bit before me, he's a little bit older than I am, but in the same area, the Reformed Church of America in New Jersey, instead of the CRC, went to Eastern Christian, went to Calvin College, and then went Catholic, much to the dismay of the CRC philosophical hierarchy. And Peter Kraft has done his work, and I've listened to a lot of Peter Kraft and enjoyed him, but have not gone Catholic. At least not yet. It was so funny when, why can't I think of his name? When the former editor of Christianity Today retired from the magazine and joined the Roman Catholic Church. It's like, the times they are a-changing. The Reformation is slowly being addressed in our midst, and I think my channel is part of that project too. And I found it difficult, while conservative Protestant churches, in my opinion, were putting out some wonderful Christians, they were often places where one couldn't be terribly honest, and that was a problem. And so often, the more progressive a church could be, at least you could be honest about certain things, and usually more honest. But ironically, increasingly, and this is probably why I'm the pastor of the IDW, increasingly these progressive churches are places that you can't be honest about other things. In terms of these issues of Genesis and cosmology, liberals could at least be honest, but offered me little in terms of what I really needed and wanted from the Bible, because they kept explaining it away and say, hey, I need a real Jesus. I need someone that tells me that the commitments and decisions to live and love in a costly way are going to be worth it in the world. And Jesus gives that to me. So if you're explains away my Jesus, I don't want to have any part of it. But the conservative churches couldn't be honest in other regards. And so I wanted a place where people could be honest. And in all fairness, you can find very conservative churches where they could be, and you can find progressive churches where they could be. But I just wanted honesty where we could talk about our doubts. And at the beginning of so you have the seeker movement, and then you have the emergent movement. The emergent movement split between the progressive evangelicals and the young, restless, and reformed. And so all of these issues are lurking underneath. Yet few could explain to me how to get out of this dilemma. And so this is what my channel is about. And this is why I'm talking to progressive evangelicals, and I'm talking to young, restless, and reforms. Not a lot of them come this way, but I'm talking to Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke and all of y'all out there, because we're working this stuff out. And the Roman Catholics have some wisdom there, and the Orthodox have some wisdom there, and the non-believers have some wisdom there, and we're actually having honest conversations like I've always wanted to have in churches, but churches somehow couldn't afford it. I needed answers to the age of decay. And so I read Miracles a lot. Help me, Saint Jack, help me. And I began to see how deeply materialism had penetrated me. And all of the fundamentalists. And I wanted to resist it. And I continually felt the modernism trap around me. But I knew I couldn't just be a fundamentalist either. And the neo-evangelicals, that's the Christianity Today, and sort of the modern evangelicals where the CRC was. I mean, that was basically my tribe on a bigger scale. Of course, I was that little group of Dutch Calvinists. And I needed to wrestle with the discarded image. And I had read a lot of Lewis, but not this book. And of course, in one of my early conversations with Byrne out there in Tbilisi, Georgia, and I know I don't say that word right, Lewis said, my favorite book is this. And I thought, I hadn't read that one. Why Byrne? Why Byrne, who took time at and then Francis Schaeffer comes into this story too, did time at L'Abri. And then I had someone come up here from L'Abri, Brazil, and found me via my YouTubes and spent a year here while he was in law school. And what's in this book? And it took me a while to get to it. And I'll keep coming back to it, because this and Miracles are dealing with similar things. And so you can find some early videos, and some of you, my beard is in the oh no phase, and so it's endangered. And so if you want the beard to stay, pipe up now, because part of me is like, let's see how big it can grow, and my wife won't divorce me. She doesn't really complain about it, but my church won't fire me, or because I noticed that I seem to get more hits or more subscribers the longer and stranger my beard gets, because the truth is, if you can't be handsome, at least be weird. So I need to keep wrestling with the discarded image, and to bridge that gap in my own imaginary. And in order to do this, I needed to talk. And the blog wasn't quite doing it. And the CRC Voices is a little listserv that mostly preoccupied with CRC things, and people go to it and think, oh, Paul goes here, and then they start reading it. It's like, why would I ever read that? Yeah, because it's sort of reading the table talk in the Christian Reformed Church. But I needed to talk. I needed better distributed cognition. Now I know these fancy Vervaeke words, and they're helping me. I needed to talk to a wider variety of people, and I needed to be honest. And that's sometimes an occupational hazard as a non-retired Christian Reformed minister. But at this point, I knew I had to face that hazard. I needed to risk it for the biscuit, as Jared often says. And I needed conversation partners, because my own soul depends on it. And my own, I can't preach honestly without dealing with these issues. And I know in terms of a local church, one has to be patient and gentle and kind with these issues because there's a lot of tripwires and hand grenades around them. And, I've exploded a few of them over the years. I've had people who have come to this church in tears and then left in anger. I've had many more have come to this church hoping to find and not really finding it. And, one of the big questions that people will ask is, why do you have this many subscribers to your YouTube channel and your church is so small? That's a good question. And I've often said what a crappy pastor I am. And, I believe that. And then people rush in, no, you're not a crappy pastor. Don't worry about my ego. My ego is really durable. And I'm just saying I can't seem to grow a church. But that doesn't really bother me because if I had a church of 1,000 people, I'd probably be annoyed by it. So I like small places. I like small things. I don't want things to grow too large that I've always got to be looking over my political shoulders. And if you look at, to jump ahead a little bit, if you look at what happened to Jordan Peterson, that's what he's facing. The poor man decided to be honest, and he's been paying for it ever since. So I read Miracles a lot, and you can find videos like how the fiery pillar, the chariot of fire, and the Tower of Babel work in the imaginary of the Bible. 158 views with 3 thumbs up. And you can see that was, again, June 2, 2017. I was playing with videos and with YouTube and trying to figure out, basically, I would get into a flow state during my Sunday morning Sunday school class, and I'd read the Bible and I'd bounce it off the mostly senior citizen women that gathered in the room because they're a pretty good example of, okay, what's communicating? What can I actually transmit? What matters? Because there is so much lived wisdom of Christianity in that room of mostly African-American women who, whatever education they had, they knew how to survive in this world and they knew how to love Jesus and they got a ton of wisdom to give the world. And so I have all these newfangled ideas and I throw it at them and then they take it and throw back other things at me and ask honest questions. And, and I'm so glad I had a Sunday school class of 8 or 10 or 12 people there because we can have an honest conversation. We can deal with these issues. And it's not a bunch of academics with books that so few people will read. These are regular people watching regular news and reading the SAC-B and having raised children and grandchildren and known the difficulties of life. I want to bring all these things together because that's what the world is. And then onto the scene comes Jordan B. Peterson. I had been wrestling with a lot of the issues in the Christian Reformed Church because of the same-sex marriage stuff. And somewhere along the line, someone had shared with me a blog post by Rod Dreher, and I saw in Rod Dreher some of the same stuff I was wrestling with. And so I started reading Rod's blog and enjoying Rod's blog and getting some new ideas from Rod's blog. And lo and behold, here's a fella wearing suspenders with a whole bunch of students around him in the midst of what seemed to be his attempt at having an honest conversation with people, saying something which really was bothering some people about something that's, important. Can a man be a real woman? What kind of a question is that? It's actually a question that's at a juncture which is going to, it's going to be important for a whole lot of reasons. And so the CRC was wrestling with same-sex marriage, provoking questions, and I increasingly saw a modernistic gospel emerging in my denomination that was deeply alien to its Heidelberg Catechism roots. And again, being high in openness and having been a reliable part of the left wing of the Christian Reformed Church, which isn't terribly left wing in the broader spectrum, I was wrestling with these issues because, in terms of the role that I'd play, I'm there with all the progressive churches who pioneered, at least for the Christian Reformed Church, 2 decades after the Reformed Church of America, the, women in office and some of these issues like that. And the old battle lines were being drawn, and I was on the other side of the line. And it's like, what's going on? And I was listening to the arguments being made, and I was listening to the rationale, and I was increasingly listening. Said, stuff's going on with this that we're not taking seriously or having honest conversations about. And just like with the Belhar, we're going to rush to some kind of vote. And maybe it's inevitable. I don't know. But people I love on both sides are going to be hurt. And I'm not sure the people that we're supposed to be helping are actually going to be helped by it. And when I listened to Jordan Peterson talk about this, and especially how I watched him acting, especially in the suspender video and some of those earlier videos, I saw something that fascinated me. And I thought, why on earth is a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto taking this stand on this issue? That's a recipe for trouble. I understood why everyone around him was angry, but I couldn't figure out how he got there and how he would be like this for this. And why isn't he just making nice and going along, which is what the majority of people do? And he wasn't. So then I thought, well, he's some, Dallas Willard taught at University of Southern California. Maybe Jordan Peterson is a Christian fundamentalist who somehow made his way through into a position at the University of Toronto. But then you start to listen to him and say, no, that's not who he is. What is he? And then he's lecturing on the Bible. And you don't have to hear much of his lectures on the Bible to realize this is not Ken Ham, okay? This is not Dobson. This is not John Piper. This is not a celebrity pastor. This guy is talking stuff that I've never heard before. And some of you might say, well, that's because you never knew Jung. And you never knew Jung because yada, yada, yada. I went to a Christian school and I lived in my own bubble and yada, yada, yada. And that's true. But there was something there. And it was not immediately apparent this was not a rehashing of the fundamentalist modernist fight. So it was immediate apparent. It was not a rehashing, but there was elements of that in there. That the background is still there. And then I watched post-Christians were paying money to watch him ramble for 2+ hours in the Bible. And he's filling up this Bader Theater. And my good friend, Phil Reinders, has a wonderful church not very far from there. And I knew he had empty seats. And another CRC light who left the CRC to the left, who was on my channel, John Sook, who I continued to follow because I was really curious about how's this going to go. So John Sook, who I did an interview with, he's got plenty of empty seats at his church in Toronto. Why are these people listening to Jordan Peterson and they're leaving saying things like, I'm curious about the Bible. I might want to check out a church. And then I'd listen to them and think, oh, poor you, if you go into a church, that's going to be a mess. But at least I saw, there's an opportunity here for an honest conversation. And Jordan Peterson is hosting honest conversations that the right is at least listening to, and the left is flipping out over. They've got Jordan Peterson derangement syndrome. I couldn't take my eyes off it. And so I did the deep dive. And how many, I just talked to Mark and posted that today, how many have done the deep dive where you just couldn't take your eyes off Jordan Peterson for about 3 or 4 months? And I had never been a YouTube listener. I'd listened to podcasts, and how do I listen to 2-3 hours of YouTube videos? How can I listen to them in the car? How can I listen to them, when I'm washing the dishes? How can I listen to them when I'm doing yard work? How can I listen to them at the end of the workday when I don't listen to them at work because I wouldn't get any work done, and so it's got to be in off hours? In fact, I had one colleague who told me, I was listening to Jordan Peterson so much I had to stop because I realized I was listening to him more than I was listening to the Bible. And I thought, I'm kind of listening to him so that I can listen to the Bible better. Or at least that's the hope. What on earth has happened to me? Then, of course, I start talking about Jordan Peterson to the people on CRC Voices and on my blog and to my colleagues. And the colleagues are like, what happened to Paul? Well, the what happened to Paul thing this is only the beginning of what happened to Paul. So, oh, come on, you can do it right. Here we go. Inside of me, I intuitively saw the connection between Peterson and what I had been working on in miracles. And I knew I could get lost. And that was the concern of my colleague who was doing the Jordan Peterson deep dive in the big wave. You can get through I don't know how much ocean swimming you've done, but waves are powerful and they can throw you around and you can pop up in the surface, not quite sure where you went or how far it's taken you. And so I wanted, sort of in a Dante's Inferno way, I wanted C.S. Lewis to be my Virgil. Guide me through the wave, Jack. Help me figure out a way through. So with miracles in one hand and YouTube in the other, let's figure out Jordan Peterson. And, Alistair Roberts, I got to keep all my Alistairs together. Alistair Roberts had written that blog post about Lewis and Jordan, so I knew someone else smarter than me was seeing it. I'm not completely off base here. But I was nervous about my faith and my career, because you do a deep dive in a wave like this, and am I going to pop up and no longer be a Christian? Well, what do I mean by that? No longer be able to trust Jesus? No longer be able to sing love songs to Jesus? No longer be able to pastor in good conscience? Pastors leave the ministry, honest ones at least, often because they I have more. See, this is part of the reason I have more. What's the word I'm looking for? I have more respect for a guy like John Sook, who leaves the CRC because he simply realizes he doesn't believe the way he used to. That's just integrity. I didn't want to be the next John Sook. Well, watching Jordan Peterson wasn't going to take me there. Was it going to make me Orthodox? Was it going to make me Roman Catholic? Well, what was it going to make me? And, I've got friends, the people I used to sit with over in the left, that I'm sure right now think that Jordan Peterson, that YouTube radicalization. Yeah. Is that me? No, it's not me. I learned Hebrew. I learned Greek. If you don't want to be radicalized one way or another, don't read. Live in a tiny little bubble where you just ossify and rigor mortis will set in. If you believe your God is a living God, and if you believe you can trust him, then trust him and follow that lamb wherever he goes. So, but don't do it foolishly. And so Lewis was going to be my Virgil. And he would guide me. Well, how do you work that? Lewis has been dead. Lewis died the year I was born. Well, he's left books. And along the way, I found more guides. Owen Barfield, friend of Lewis. Dallas Willard, whose book, The Divine Conspiracy, years before I had read, and that had radicalized me a little bit. And Tim Keller had radicalized me a little bit, but if I could be radicalized in a PCA sort of way. And then, new partners, Jonathan Peugeot. I first started listening to Jonathan Peugeot. I didn't know what I was listening to. And then it began to open up. And John Vervaeke, Strawn put me onto him. And, a pagan partner. Of course, Virgil leading Dante through the Inferno. Who is Virgil? Why does Dante pick a pagan to lead him through hell? And not just these ones that names you'll recognize, but, Job and Jeff and, John Van Donk. And, my relationship with John Van Donk really got going when I started talking Jordan Peterson and Joey and Rick. And, how many of you, and I'm sorry if I didn't say your name, but down on the Discord server and people who leave comments, good and bad. Because, the nasty comments are orienting as well. Now, a nasty comment almost always says more about the commenter than it does about what they're commenting on because of how much projection we do. But it's the same thing about those who leave glowing comments. We live in our projections to a deep, deep level, more than we like to imagine. So, yeah, been making my way through. And of course, when I had my conversation with Topher recently, Topher says, 2-3 years ago, I wanted to have a conversation with you a lot worse than I do now. And I thought, I know exactly what you mean. Boy, at that moment, I wanted to talk to Jordan Peterson. I want to sit him down and, I ask him a million questions and but talk to Warren Mills about meeting Big Daddy Don Garlitz. Warren Mills grew up in an Australian and a petrol head, he called himself, and built his own race car, and Big Daddy Don Garlitz was his role model, and finally made it to America and met Big Daddy, and never meet your heroes. Because so much of your heroes are projection, of course, and the real person will go through. And of course, Jordan had his status rocket ride for all kinds of reasons. And can I get a conversation with Jordan Peterson? Nope. That point he had 200,000-300,000 some YouTube subscribers and was already too inaccessible. But it was early enough that some of the transformations that have happened in him from 2016 to 2021 hadn't happened yet. He's gone to the underworld again, and he's having to rescue his father, and he's in the process of becoming a real boy. I hope. And he was already at that point too inaccessible. And again, this is an instinctive reaction to finding someone or something that is giving you light, even if you're not exactly sure what to do with it. And what I really wanted to see was a dialogue between Jordan Peterson and C.S. Lewis. And there are a few people were talking about Lewis and Peterson at the same time. I wanted to see him have a dialogue within him and N.T. Wright. And I actually, as I mentioned early on, I taught when I did a VIP thing, and I mentioned it to Jordan, and Jordan said, I'd like to do that. I've got some of his books. But Jordan was on a rocket that, you get up into the atmosphere and the air gets pretty thin and you can't really breathe. And, Jordan came crashing down like Icarus, and just the little indications on Twitter seems to be finding his wings again, and that's a very happy thing. And I continue to keep Jordan in my prayers. But I wanted to see Jordan and Lewis talk about each other. And Jordan, in one conversation with someone, had said, well, Lewis was this English apologist. Yeah, he was. But it was more than that. He was dealing with this meaning crisis. And again, as I put the little clip of Mark connecting Vervaeke and Peterson. Yeah, the meaning crisis. When Vervaeke said meaning crisis, like, aha, Lewis, Peterson, this is what we're talking about. No, I knew I couldn't talk to Peterson. That wasn't going to work. He was still doing sort of the Patreon things. But I could talk to his work. And in a lot of ways, his work was of more interest to me than the man himself. And I could talk to his spiritual cloud. Continuing evolution of that word, spirit. You know, before this, I had been watching how bloggers like Dreer and Sullivan were managing the work and spiritual clouds of the people out there in the world. And I watched how Sullivan and Dreer were doing it. And, you know, I'd played with, that's part of the reason that I was doing a blog before. And I thought, I wonder if I can do this on video. And I thought, actually, video kind of lends itself more to it. Because I had seen Twitch and I'd watched video gamers and I was rereading Neil Postman, and I knew people didn't read, but would they watch? They were watching Peterson. That was obvious. They would watch far longer videos than I thought before. Before, my goal was 2 or 3 minute videos because everyone says the videos have to be short. They don't have to be. Would they watch? Would they talk back? So, a pastor comments on Jordan Peterson's Bible series, Prolegomena of Prolegomena. 18 minutes. I thought that was long. I could summon Jordan Peterson by interacting with his videos. And keep track with Lewis. My Virgil was also only accessible to me through writing. So, just sort of like Dreer and Sullivan could take pieces and put them together on a blog post, I could take pieces and put them together on YouTube. And now other people were doing this, but remember, I wasn't watching YouTube. I was, like most of my colleagues still today, I was just going about my business of a day job, trying to be a pastor, trying to be a father, trying to be an American, trying to be a productive person in Sacramento, California. But then other people were in on it too. And the email started to come and the phone call started to come. And I started meeting people in real life. And Vendonk and Rick are like, let's start a meetup. See what happens. People would come. And they did. They came. And they kept coming. Some people would come now and then. Some people would come almost every week. I started getting more YouTube subscribers. And I started getting emails. And I started getting phone calls. And visitors would come to the church. And they'd come to the church a little disappointed, like, well, this isn't quite what's going on. I came for Jordan Peterson, but I saw this. And I always smile every time someone says, if I lived in Sacramento, I'd go to your church. And I think, I'm not so sure. Because the church is a living, breathing thing that is very different than just me on video. Me on video is just me on video. The church? Oh, it's wild. Sometimes in a very boring way. So I kept making videos. Initially I thought, I don't know how many of these I'm going to make. And then when I saw my own tiny little status bottle rocket go off, I got nervous. And I thought, I don't really want to get any much more than 1,000 or 2 subscribers. I don't want this messing up my life, messing up my marriage, messing up my church. I don't need that trouble. Life is hard enough. Never mind a status rocket. But the distributed cognition was really good because, again, I've said this many times, as a pastor of a small church, having honest conversations with a diverse group of people, and I don't mean their skin color. I've always had honest conversations with people of color. My whole life I've been surrounded by more people of color than white people. It's just by virtue of my father's career choices and my career choices. That's not the diversity I'm talking about. I'm talking about diversity of ideas. I'm talking about people who would never want to go to church because they don't believe any of that. Those are the kind of people I needed to talk to. I needed to talk to people who would never bother going to church because they found New Age stuff was more life-giving than anything I was dishing out in a Sunday sermon. I needed to talk to those people, and I needed them to speak to me honestly. I needed them to get beyond worrying about my feelings. Don't worry about my feelings. My feelings are my thing to manage. I'm just going to say nice things to you because of your feelings. If you say nice things to me because you care, you believe them, that's fine. But if you say nice things to me because of some other reason, tell me what you really think. Be honest. And if you say, I think this is a load of crap, I'm not going to wither. If you think I'm a bigot or I'm a patriarchist or whatever bad thing you think I am, tell me. Rather have that than all kinds of other stupid people tricks. So this was just wonderful. People would come into my church and tell me exactly what they thought, which is usually not what you get in church. People are playing other games. And again, those other games are important, and I understand why we play them. But I just wanted people to be honest, because if I'm wasting my time as a minister, I want to know it. And then, lo and behold, one of my viewers has, at that point, Peterson, if you were supporting him at $100 a month, you could get a half hour with Jordan. And I really was glad he had that. And I decided that, because people were saying, start a Patreon. So I started a Patreon, and then people would send money. And then it's like, Patreon says, well, give people financial incentives. And I thought, I want to have honest conversations. If the only people I get to talk to are those who have the money, and for whatever reason, the commitment to give me $100 a month, me, I don't mean my church. I mean me, $100 a month. Those aren't, I want to say thank you. Those aren't the conversations I want to have. I want to have people who want to talk to me and tell me what they think. And, Cassidy early on was, Cassidy wasn't terribly taken by Jordan Peterson, was friends with the guy named Christian. And Cassidy heard that I was having conversations with randos and thought that was cool. And so, first conversation we had was about tipless restaurants. And the second conversation, why she didn't like Jordan Peterson very much. And I thought it was great. I don't want you to agree with me. Well, sure, part of me does, but another part of me wants you to just tell me what you think. Why can't churches be places where people speak at least the truth as they see it? That's what I want for church. Yeah, they may be wrong, and this gets complicated in church because churches also have a confessional function. They have to, and they're there to witness for Jesus. Yeah, but the environment should be where people say what they think, because as a pastor, you're not going to do anybody any good unless you actually have some understanding about what's going on out there. So Josh got me a slot, and if you watch the video, I didn't tell, probably in violation to the law, I didn't tell Jordan I was recording it, but I was not going to record it. And I asked him at the end for permission, and he gave it graciously, and it was a wonderful conversation. But I knew, it put me on the other end of what many people have been, at least. But I knew I wanted to, I wanted to have an honest conversation with him. And I think we did that. I think it was good. We are having more honest conversations, and I'm glad about that. And that's why I don't want the Discord to be just a Christian puddle. And I talked after the last one, maybe we need to have Atheist Week at question and answer, where, if you're a member of a church, you're not allowed to ask a question. And I'm doing my own identity politics because, well, maybe just for a week, because I am surrounded by so many Christians. And again, I love that. That's why we're in the body of Christ, to be surrounded by Christians, to do all of our own recalibrating according to the Word of God and the witness of the saints and the testimony of the church and the cloud of witnesses, and yes to all of that, but it can't be insular. And we need to actually be able to speak the truth in love as we see it. The modernist fundamentalist impasse is slowly breaking down as modernism goes away. And people can speak their truth, and we could have a level of trust with one another. And sure, we had tribes and camps and agendas, but the sense was we had a bigger mission together to find the truth and to love one another and to treat each other with kindness and respect. And Jordan sort of became a summoning stone. That's really what he did. And here's the last appearance that I was at of his in San Francisco, and I developed a relationship with the organizers of it, and so our meetup had a field trip, and that was a great day. It was a great day. But Jordan was already just in a lot of pain then, obviously, and it was before his pause. But we're getting closer to having the kinds of conversations we wanted to have. And we're helping each other get to where we wanted to get. And again, notice the geography in the talk. And again, one of the things that I'm most gratified by are some of the sub-channels, the Randos United, And yeah, I know it's if you're doing conversations with randos, you're not going to get voted up the YouTube algorithm anytime soon. It's an attentional economy. It's celebrity driven, yada, yada, yada. But at least while YouTube is still willing to host these things, and I don't listen to all of them. I can't, just like most of you can't listen to all my videos, and that's okay. But, Mary and what she's done with her channel, and Karen and the Meaning Code and what she's done with her channel, with Michael and Matt and Mark and Manuel and Julian and Esther and Job and Luke and more high profile partners like Jonathan Pajot and John Vervaeke and Sevilla over at Equality Existence and the Bridges of Meaning Discord. Yeah. God is good. God is good. We're having honest conversations, and for me as a Christian minister, again, it's the most effective evangelism I've ever done in my life. And then the online pastoring, and it's interesting, two of the conversations that really stuck out to people. My conversation with Sally recently, and the one with Poe. 90% of my conversations are with men, but these two talks with young mothers, that's not incidental, seem to really get at what's going on, because I'm sure there's something about motherhood that these two women are raising infants, and the focus on their life is, what kind of world will my child inherit? What is true in the world? How can I live it out? Yeah. And so the pastoring through online conversations, some of them public, and again, the doing them publicly. I had a conversation last week with another woman who was, again, just a transformative conversation, and she doesn't want to share it publicly for very legitimate reasons, and I will not pressure anyone to do so. Because YouTube is not the place necessarily for your personal stuff, especially if it's has the threat of doing some harm to your life. Or if you just want to stay private, especially because my channel's a little bigger, but at the same time, I know it's, my relationship with these individuals can't be that of what it is in a local church. The speed is different. The relationships are different. In a local church, we're in the body, and so there's many more who are connecting with them, and that's sort of true with them via YouTube and Discord servers. And how much of church can happen online? It's an open question. COVID is a vast experiment in that, and even after COVID, it isn't going away. And why can I have these more honest conversations in this disruptive, chaotic space like YouTube that it's harder to do in church? And again, there's real reasons both ways. Opponent processing is always with us. It is reductive, but how far can we get in an approximation? And what things are we able to do better online that we can't do in church? And so value the tool and not simply reduce it or dismiss it. Online and in person are going to continue to grow together. And what does this mean for in real life church? I don't know. I inadvertently approximated the Church Planters Project. So before I was doing any of this, I was working with church planters in Sacramento. And one of the best practices that church planters do is they go to coffee shops and they sit down and have dozens or hundreds or better even thousands of conversations with people. You can read Rick Warren when he first went to Southern California to plant Saddleback, went door to door. Bill Hybels did the same thing, did surveys. What do you hate about church? You've got to listen to people. You've got to find out how to get honest conversations. And I've managed to have hundreds of them now. How do I manage this and put it together into one whole piece? I've had exponentially more evangelistic impact than I ever had before, but my questions about what it means to be a witness to Jesus Christ, what it means to be a Christian, are more profound than ever. And again, that's disturbing in a church context because churches, and see, I think part of our problem with honest conversations in churches is because churches are doing so much propaganda. Churches are trying to say, here is my package, won't you buy it? And churches should be more, here is a community, won't you participate? Churches don't have a package. That's idolatry. That turns Jesus Christ and his Holy Spirit into a step program. It's a living God in a live environment. Honest conversations are some of the best things we can do. We've got to have them. Because you can grow a church big by selling a product. But you're not helping people. Well, you're helping them somewhat, but all your product is going to reach its end. Even an amazing product like AA reaches its end because I've had people in my church that they got sober through AA and it helped them and they turned their life over to a higher power and they figured things out, but they came back to church because they're like, the product arrived at its end and I need something living. I need conversation partners. I have to mention my friend Neil Hand in that context. Taught me so much. Passed away a few years ago. Taught me so much. Miss him so much. His wife, his widow, she knows how to have honest conversations. She's one of the few people in the church who would tell me exactly what she thought. I love it. But you say, Paul, don't you worry, this could ruin your faith by taking it off of a product, taking it out of the CRC Overton window, making you unable to get a pastorship at a bigger church. That ship has sailed. If someone offered me the senior pastor position at a mega church, I doubt very much I'd take it. If I would go on staff at a large church, I'd have some pretty real restrictions about what I would and wouldn't do. Well, I'll preach. Well, I'll lead. But don't isolate me from the randos. Because when your leadership is isolated from the randos and hierarchies bind and blind, we can get to a certain place, you can no longer catch signals. All of your signals are intermediated by all of the propagandists, the church propagandists and the state propagandists and all of the agent propagandist. Now, again, there's no getting around the propaganda, but it's in the randos, in the individuals, where you can begin to see the real patterns. And it's for the same reason it's looking past through history. Again, that's all mediated by the winners and that which is devoted to text, and on and on and on. But it's the challenge we have to know the truth and to know the world. And so, well, what's the point of this video? The point of this video is to tell the story about how I got here and why I care. And if I manage, and I'm thinking about doing a class or maybe even doing some writing on this, because I think I've learned something about the world. And it's my duty to share it with my colleagues and my friends, if they still want to listen to me after I've been radicalized by Jordan B. Peterson. And so, yeah, I did some of that in Melbourne, Australia, thanks to Warren Mills. And I did some of that at the Independent Institute in the Bay Area, thanks to those good people. Sally says I should train pastors, and I say I'm kind of trying to do that right now. Maybe I should try and up that and do it a little bit more intentionally. I'm trying to model pastoral conversations. I'm trying to model evangelism. I'm trying to model what the Christian life is. I'm trying to model being a Christian right here, right now, in the midst of everything that we have. Jesus, will you now restore the kingdom to Israel? Acts 1. It's not for you to know the times, but you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth on the internet. You will be my witnesses, and you'd better be a witness to that honest, seeking, probing, demanding, hungering faith. Because someone just recently brought this up. He who has been forgiven little loves little. He who is living in an insular bubble where everything is warm and cozy doesn't hunger and thirst for righteousness much. And if you read again the Sermon on the Mount, it's those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, they will be satisfied. The meek will inherit the earth. Job's going to say, oh, Paul got in his preaching mood. I did. I'm a preacher. That's who I am. It's what I am. But I care. I don't just care about the precious saints at Living Stones. I care about the people who will never come to Living Stones. I care about the people who won't come into a church. I care about the people who can't get out of their mother's basement. I care about the people who are ideologically possessed. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believed in him will have eternal life. Well, what do you mean by believe? Whoever hungers and thirsts for him, whoever wants to see Jesus more clearly. I think part of the reason Jesus continues to radicalize is because you can't read the Gospels and not see an honest man. So that's what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I have to continue to do it. And I'll continue to do it lousy because, Ray Brinks was my mentor when I went to the Dominican Republic as a wet behind the ears seminary intern. And, you go there and you've got all of these things in mind. You have all this projection and you say, well, why don't we do things like this? And I remember Ray one day saying to me, sometimes doing something poorly is better than not doing anything. Yeah, he's right. So you can be the judge of how poor I'm doing this, but this is what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and how I got here. So maybe coming up, a few more videos on evangelism. I'm going to have to talk about what evangelism is, and that gets scary because, well, I'm just as much a believer in the church as I ever was. I'm more of a believer in the resurrection of Jesus Christ than I ever was. But the questions get more complex. What does it mean to be a Christian? That haunts. What is the church for? How should the church be organized? if the church's job is to seek and save the lost, what does the church need to do? What kind of risks can we take? Well, our Father in heaven, from his sky palace and his decorated chair, would send down his Son to brave viruses and Herod's soldiers and mobs in the Galilee with a unwelcome sermon evaluation at Nazareth in Luke 5. He seemed to risk plenty. I think part of the reason Jordan Peterson rose is that we could tell he was taking risks. You have to take risks. And to the degree that Jordan Peterson stops taking risks, he'll lose his audience. It's the same for me. I haven't risked much, really. Because to be honest is to risk. Because the truth is always stranger. It's always more demanding. It's always scarier. It's always more threatening. That's what truth is. That's why you can't see God. Watch my sermons from the last few weeks. Not just the rough drafts, but the final drafts on the church channel. That's why you can't see God. It'll undo you. You can't handle him. Dallas Willard's answer, who goes to heaven? Dallas Willard says, anyone who can stand it. We get to stand it because, well, Jesus brings us there. And I mean that in so many different ways. So, yeah. How did I get here? Where is here? Well, this is here. And this is how I got here. Let's have honest conversations.